Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Frederick the Great, and Geoffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. All right, guys, welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. This is the last episode in this series of Back to the Future, where we went to all the way to what I call the end of the Middle Ages papacy. And we looked at the papacy of the 19th century. And what really is the papacy of the 19th century is, of course, the papacy of Pius IX. But I picked this series specifically because it's the end of an era that started all the way back in the year 752. That's the 8th century that went all the way to the 19th century, a time period of almost, actually a little over 1100 years, a whole millennium section of history that was dominated by a push and a pull inside of the Roman papacy. The popes as a secular power and the popes as a spiritual leader, a leader of a secular state and a leader of the Western Christianity. This power ebbed and flowed in both the secular world and the religious world all throughout this 1100 years. Sometimes the secular power was up and the religious power was up. Sometimes both were down. Sometimes one was up, one was down, and vice versa. But this is the Middle Ages. It's really the Dark Ages. I know some people don't like that term, but the Dark Ages, all throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages, and then well into the early modern period, and then into the actual modern period. But let's review this 40 episode series that we've done. We talked about certain things like the Risorgimento, which 8 episodes, including a series done by Marco Capelli of the Storia d'Italia podcast, and then Joe Pascone of the Turning Tides History podcast. We talked about the French Revolution. That was 5 episodes where we talked with Will of the Gray History podcast. We talked about the Enlightenment, the rise and the fall of the Jesuits, Freemasonry and secularists, where we talked about that with author John Dickey. We talked about modernism, including Marxism, with Professor Andrew Hart. We talked about the shrinking papal states, the expanding religious authority, which we just most recently talked about that with Professor Sean Blanchard. There's just so much change just in this, basically what we did in this podcast of about 75 years. We started in the late 1700s and we ended in the late 1800s, 75 to 100 years. The 17th and the 18th century papacy was really moribund an institution. It was losing religious prestige to local councils and institutions. The papacy was firmly in control of the papal states, but it was really just a backward medieval principality. It wasn't keeping a pace with what was going on in other, even neighboring communities, let alone what was going on in the world. It was also an institution that was still, in a way, reacting to the Protestant Reformation all the way back in the early 1500s. It took the 1500s and the 1600s and the 1700s for the papacy to really find its ground. And in a lot of ways, this was, I'd say, in a way worse time period than even the Renaissance popes, because at least the Renaissance popes were fabulously wealthy and they had really strong power. This is a time where the papacy it didn't have that panache that it had just a few years earlier. So we're even seeing a era inside of an era. And that particular era of the papacy, this papacy that's just trudging along, ends in 1799 with the death of Pope Pius VI. And that was really, could have been the end of the papacy, period. I mean, can you believe that in 1799, Citizen Brodsky died in Avignon, France, and that could have been the end of the whole story. That's just such a huge what if. What if the papacy had essentially gone away, or in some way had been maybe absorbed into the French secular state, or just became a local bishop, the Bishop of Rome. And the Bishop of Rome is just the religious leader of this one almost backwater city inside of Italy. That's not what will happen in the future, but that could have very easily happened. 1799 is maybe the lowest point of the papacy in its entire 2,000 plus year history. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. Now let's get to the 19th century. Well, we talked about so many issues. We talked about the fall, the rise, the fall of Napoleon, the Risorgimento, Italian unification, the rise, the fall, the rise again of the Jesuits, the Scotch taping of the Ancien regimes after the fall of Napoleon. Basically, Britain and the powers of Europe trying to figure out what the heck are we going to do with this Europe that was radically altered by Napoleon. Let's just try and put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Ultimately, it works to some degree. Then we have the tumultuous revolutions of 1848, where the Pope Pius IX, is actually forced to flee Rome, another really low point in the papacy. We see during this time period of the 1800s where an increasing reactionary strain comes into the papacy. There's really no pope that's really pushing for big changes. That's what makes Pope Pius IX, when he first comes in, he seems to be a moderate reformer. That changed very quickly. the popes before Pius IX generally were not well received on the world stage either. The Pope was extremely unpopular amongst Catholics. So we see a dichotomy or a huge gap really between what leaders are thinking about the papacy versus what people are thinking about the papacy, and what politicians versus your average person on the street thinks about their religion and then their connection to the Pope. They're very strongly connected to the Pope. During this whole time period, there's a vast increase in the religious power of the papacy. We see this idea of ultramontanism increasing. It's building a case for papal infallibility and absorbing the power of local synods of bishops. It's also marginalizing what we called the isms, Josephism, Jansenism, Gallicanism, where these were all movements to take power away from Rome and put it into the local councils. It's not to say to get rid of the Pope, but it's really to change the whole power structure. And maybe they had gone too far in doing that. And this whiplash back to the papacy in Rome is the reaction, where it became an overreaction. It could also be a reaction completely unrelated or even related. I mean, there's no reason to keep those two things separately, but that the popes of Rome, as they saw their secular power crashing and burning, that they were going to try and take back more religious power. It's a really interesting thing to think about, and it's something I would love to discuss more so, even as we move on from this series. We looked also at the papal secular power in the papal states. It was diminishing. The Risorgimento squeezed out the papacy out of so much of its lands. They kept chipping away, and all the way down to this core of just Rome itself and a little bit of its environs surrounding it. The only thing that really kept Rome as a papal enclave was the intervention of foreign powers, particularly the French. By the 1870, only the Vatican City, which is a small neighborhood outside of the old city proper of Rome on the other side of the Tiber River, was the only place left that the popes controlled as their own secular state. That leads us to Vatican I, which is the ultimate ascendancy of the Pope as supreme primate of the Catholic Church. This is where we get papal infallibility from. And as we see, it's really where papal infallibility, it wasn't invented, because as we discussed in so many episodes, there's ideas of papal infallibility that go back almost to the beginning of the church, at least arguments for it. But at Vatican I, that's where papal infallibility is actually codified into an exact doctrine. But even inside of that, if we looked at what the spectrum of belief were, there was basically papal maximalists, papal infallibility maximalists. The one we kept always bringing up was Cardinal Manning, of an English Protestant who converted to Catholicism. He wanted it basically, if the Pope got up in the morning and wanted a cup of coffee, that was an infallible statement. He was a maximalist. It went all the way to the opposite side of the spectrum, where the conciliarists lived, that they wanted it where the entire church would be, the Pope would be a figurehead, a very important figurehead who would have a lot of say in what was going on. But the real business of the church would be done through councils and synods and discussion. These conciliarists generally didn't have a seat at the table at Vatican I, but somewhere not quite in the middle, but in the papal infallibility camp were this group of minimalists, and there was many of them. The person that we brought up a lot was Cardinal John Newman, but there was a lot of minimalists who felt that papal infallibility was a real thing and it was important, but it needed to be tempered and it needed to be structured. It couldn't just be the Pope saying anything that shot out of the Pope's mouth was an infallible statement, that it had to fit certain criteria. And that's essentially what comes out of the council. for the most part as well, that was a very popular opinion. It wasn't like that was a forced opinion of the minimalist infallibilists. It was that was a broad consensus amongst the church. Now, the fallout, this isn't addressed as much in the series. We talked a little bit about the fallout of the Risorgimento with Joe Pascone, and we talked a little bit about it with Sean Blanchard about the fallout. But essentially, Vatican II, the council from the 1950s, 1960s, was really a correction to Vatican I. And if you think about it, it shows that the maximalist position didn't win at Vatican I because a maximalist infallible pope would not need to have councils anymore. So the pope felt that there was a need to call this Vatican II council. The history of this is really still playing out. We look at Pope Francis. He's having a synod of synodality, which is a discussion of where are these local synods going to play and how do they deal with these local issues. You have Pope John Paul II, who was Pope through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and into the early 2000s. And he went back and forth, and he was really the first superstar Pope, rock star Pope. Go to a country and the audience is filled with tens of hundreds of thousands of young people who were hanging on every single one of his words. You get Pope Benedict, who's after that, not quite the same way, maybe for some corners of the Catholic Church, but he's playing out this issue of power. And then now with Pope Francis, he's maybe the one who's taking it to that next level. And Pope Francis, as of this recording in 2023, is not in great shape health-wise, and the length of his papacy is at this point, the clock is running out. So the big story is going to be what happens after Pope Francis. Is it going to be a correction back towards more infallibility, or is it going to be towards more, what we could really call conciliarism, or at least more local control amongst the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church? And how is that going to work with ecumenism and conversations with other church groups? It's going to be fascinating to see how that next conclave plays out. I personally think, in my own opinion, is that we're going to get a very Francis-like Pope next. I don't think that there's enough power amongst the quote unquote reactionary elements of the church. I could be vastly and completely wrong, but that'll be interesting to see if there's going to be a reactionary backlash, or whether it's going to be a carrying on of Pope Francis's vision. It could also, this is really speculative. It could be the time for a placeholder pope. We just don't know at this point. Now, Pope Francis, he's also the first social media post. Pope Francis is also the first social media pope, where every post, everything that he says, every interview almost turns into an infallible statement, especially with the Catholic apologists on one side and then apologists on the other side on the internet. Oh no, he's that Pope Francis is completely wrong and we need to go more in this direction. But if they get the Pope that they like, then they're going to be more maximalists for papal control. I think we're seeing the fruition of the social media culture really soak into church politics now of the popes, and it's a fascinating thing to watch if you're somebody who's interested in how organizations develop. Really, you can look at it that every post that the Pope makes or every statement that he makes is almost could be viewed in a way of soft infallibility. But then on the opposite side, you have everyone with a YouTube channel or a significant Twitter following can also come along and say whatever they want in response and get a lot of views and a lot of clicks and get a lot of momentum there. So it's a real push and pull between almost those same arguments of the 19th century of conciliarism versus infallibility, but played out in a very different medium. In essence, you have it where the Pope can be even more powerful than he ever was, but then in another way that everybody with the social media account can become their own Pope. It's the very essence of top down versus bottom up. In my opinion, this is probably the biggest and clearest view of how organizations work. And it's the biggest case study of how an institution and an organization can evolve over the course of thousands of years. And as new technologies develop, how is this organization going to develop into that and lean into that technology and lean in more so than even the technology? Because we look at the technologies that really changed the papacy and changed the institutions of the world, like the printing press. It wasn't the technology, it was how the technology was used. That's how we need to look into it in the 21st century as we move along, and probably some of the people who are still listening to this podcast, how we look at it into the 22nd century and beyond. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Will this papacy take the top-down hierarchy approach? Will it start to look at bottom-up conciliarism and councils and synods that are informed by the top? It's a really fascinating mesh, because these hierarchical institutions we've seen with the papacy can become extremely fossilized and so desperately need reform but reject reform that it basically blows up the system. But it also can be flexible as well. We've seen that with, honestly, in the papacy since John Paul II, that the Catholic Church has balanced the quote unquote liberals with the conservatives, with the traditionalists, with all these different groups, liberation theology, that it's kept them under the house. But how long can that work for? It will be very interesting to see. With Francis's end coming at some time soon, will there be this move back? Will there be a Vatican III? Only time will tell. And then my last thought on this whole thing is, because of the institutions that we have today and the technology and the social structure of instantaneous communications, is that going to push change faster, or is it going to slow it down? Is that change going to be people are going to go into their bubbles and build their walls and their ivory towers and any other cliche metaphor you can use? Are they going to stick into those and fight it out? And is that going to slow down the process of evolution in the church, or is it are people going to start breaking through and using these communication methods to move the church forward faster? And is slow change going to hurt the church, or is fast change going to hurt the development of the Roman Catholic Church? How will all of this affect ecumenical relationships with the Protestants, with the Eastern churches, with ecumenical outside of even Christianity whatsoever? What is this all going to play out? It all applies to this series, because this series, to me at least, really showed me that there was a definitive end in how the papacy had operated for half of its existence. Now it needs to move into maybe its third phase or its fourth phase, but it's moved out of that medieval phase. It's got to find new bearings in this world. We live especially for people out there in the United States, being such a young country, we think things move fast and we expect things to move fast. Things are not going to move fast in an institution that's 2,000 years old. That's what's going to be the thing. Are we moving past a intermediate phase now of this modern era papacy into something brand new? That is what I am fascinated to see. So many questions. What do you think? Join the conversations. You can find links to all the social media, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, our Facebook group, YouTube. All of them are at our new landing page, a2zhistorypage.start.page. That's ATOZ, Z for our Commonwealth friends, historypage.start.page. You can email us at steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Any of those places are great places to like, subscribe. And then the biggest thing is we're not major media out there. We don't get algorithms or any sort of things revolving around algorithms, but you can help us by just telling a friend. I know personally of someone who told a friend about the podcast, and his friend is now a listener. The telling friends is the best way to do it. Share a post on social media in conversation. Oh, you love history, the history of the papacy. That really, really, really helps us. Look for new series soon, and I will talk to you next time.